By the middle of the 8th century, the politics of the Deccan was changing not because of a sudden explosion, but because of a slow exhaustion. From the outside, everything looked the same as it had for years. The king was on the throne, the court functioned, taxes were collected. But from within, the backbone of power had weakened. Orders no longer traveled as far as before, and even when they did, they were not followed with the same loyalty. The Chalukya rulers of Badami had once been the most powerful rulers of the Deccan. They had maintained a balance between the north and the south, and had shaped the Deccan as an organized political region. But over time, this system began to collapse under its own weight. The empire was large, its boundaries were stretched, and administration was becoming increasingly dependent on local powers. This dependence slowly turned into a weakness. The Samanta system was originally a practical solution. The center could not rule directly everywhere, so land and authority were given to local powers. In return, they provided taxes and military support. As long as the central power remained strong, this system worked. But the moment the center weakened, the same Samantas who were once the foundation of the system gradually became its alternatives. In the Deccan, this process was especially clear. Power was not disappearing, it was fragmenting. And when power fragments, it becomes available to move into new hands. It was in this environment that the Rashtrakuta power was taking shape. The Rashtrakutas were not external invaders. They did not arrive with a new ideology or a revolutionary movement. They grew within the same political structure that had earlier brought the Chalukyas to power. This is why their rise does not feel sudden, but almost natural. Danti Durga was a part of this very system. He was a Samanta under the Chalukya ruler Kirtivarman II. Formally, he was a subordinate. He paid tribute and provided military support when required. But in practice, he was slowly building an independent identity. This was not an open rebellion. Danti Durga did not immediately declare independence, nor did he directly challenge his overlord. He first did what every ambitious Samanta does, secured his territory, strengthened his military power, and established influence in the surrounding regions. All of this happened while remaining within the framework of Chalukya authority. At this stage, calling Danti Durga a rebel would be an oversimplification of history. He was more a political realist than a rebel. He understood that Chalukya power was no longer what it once was, and that this weakness was not temporary but structural. When the final confrontation did take place, it did not happen as one great dramatic battle that later stories would glorify. The Chalukya authority was already hollow from within. Danti Durga's victory was not the cause of that collapse, but its proof. It was the moment when a reality that already existed was formally acknowledged. But Danti Durga knew that power based only on the sword does not last. In the Indian political tradition, victory alone was not enough to become a king. Legitimacy was as necessary as strength. That is why he performed the Hiranyagarbh ritual. This ritual was not a search for spiritual liberation. It was a clear political statement. Its meaning was that his authority now came not from a former overlord, not from any old agreement, but from his own position. It was a symbolic rebirth, marking the end of a Samanta and the birth of an independent ruler. It was neither the result of a sudden rebellion nor of any divine coincidence. It was the next stage of a system that was already changing. Danti Durga did not create a new political language. He used the same tools that rulers before him had always used: military power, administrative control, and symbols of legitimacy. The only difference was that he used them at the right time and in the right circumstances. And that is why Rashtrakuta power was able to expand rapidly after him. His successors did not have to start from nothing. They inherited a foundation that was already in place, a new power in the Deccan that was no longer easy to challenge. At this point, Deccan politics had completely changed. The Chalukya age had not simply ended, but it had been replaced. The center of power had shifted, and its weight now rested on the shoulders of the Rashtrakutas. In the years to come, this power would not remain limited to the Deccan alone. It would intervene in the politics of North India, create new balances in the south, and influence the entire subcontinent. But that story was only just beginning. This was the birth of the Rashtrakutas, not through a proclamation, not through a miracle, but through steps taken by recognizing the demands of the time. After Danti Durga, Rashtrakuta power did not grow like an uncertain experiment. The foundation had already been made so strong that the next generation did not take much time to decide what had to be done next. Power had been achieved. Now the challenge was to maintain it and expand it. By the time of Danti Durga's successor, Krishna I, the Rashtrakutas had clearly understood that political control alone was not enough. By this time, Rashtrakuta power had become stable in the central Deccan. To give stability to an empire, it must be recorded in the memory of the people. This was the time when Rashtrakuta power began to speak through stone. The Kailasa Temple at Ellora was not just a religious structure. It was a political statement written not in words, but in scale, labor, and courage. A whole mountain cut and shaped into a temple was enough to announce which power was now decisive in the Deccan. This power was not only capable of winning wars, but also of controlling resources, labor, and time. This was the phase when Rashtrakuta authority was being organized from within. Administration, land grants, relations with Samantas, everything was based on balance. Samantas still existed, but they were no longer loose links as before. They were being controlled, bound into the system, and replaced when required. After this comes the reign of Dhruv, and from here Rashtrakuta politics begins to expand beyond the Deccan. This was not a sudden ambition. North Indian politics was already unstable. The Palas, Pratiharas, and other powers were adjusting their balance among themselves, and this instability gave the Deccan power an opportunity to look northward. Dhruv made it clear for the first time that the Rashtrakutas would not remain just a regional power. He intervened in the politics of North India, not to rule it, but to show that the Deccan would no longer only react, but would also decide direction. This intervention reached its peak during the time of Govinda III. Govinda III's campaigns are often described with exaggeration, but the real story is even more interesting. The impact of his power is seen more in the acceptance of other rulers than in battles alone. Many rulers considered it better to avoid direct conflict with him. This was the moment when Rashtrakuta power stood at its height. Influence in the south up to the Kaveri region, and intervention in the politics of the Ganga region in the north, this was not permanent occupation, but a display of power. It was meant to show that if required, the Deccan could also bend the politics of the north. But every empire has to decide whether it will move only by the sword or by balance. This is where the reign of Amogvarsh I takes a distinct place in history. Unlike his predecessors, he was not wallowing. He gave priority to stability over expansion. This decision was not weakness, but an understanding of circumstances. By Amogvarsh's time, the empire had become so large that fighting wars in every direction could be self-destructive. He reduced conflicts, made agreements with Samantas, and gave importance to cultural protection. The growth of Kannada literature, patronage of scholars, and religious tolerance, all these were parts of his policy. Here, the Rashtrakuta Empire became more than a military power. It became a political system. Even so, the Rashtrakutas never completely moved away from North Indian politics. Kannauj still remained a symbol of power. Controlling Kannauj was not just about controlling a city, it was a claim over legitimacy in North India. That is why when the Rashtrakutas attacked Kannauj during the time of Indra III, its impact went far beyond the battlefield. Pratihara power received a deep blow. But this subject is so important that doing justice to it in brief would not be fair. That is why the conflict over Kannauj and its entire politics has been explained by us in a separate, detailed video. For viewers who want to deeply understand that North-South power struggle, that video is an essential extension of this story. After Amogvarsh, Rashtrakuta power slowly turns again toward the military path. To maintain the empire, balance alone was no longer enough. New powers were emerging, especially the Cholas in the south. From here, we enter a phase where the Rashtrakutas once again had to prove their existence. During the time of Indra III and later Krishna III, it became clear that this empire was not yet finished. The campaigns of Krishna III established Rashtrakuta power in the south one final time in a complete manner. Reaching Rameshwaram was not just a military achievement. It was a symbol meant to show that Deccan power could still influence the entire south. But in history, every peak also brings with it a downward slope. The Rashtrakuta Empire had now expanded so much that maintaining it became more difficult than ever before. Samanthas were once again becoming powerful. The center's dependence on them was increasing, and within this dependence, the future crisis was hidden. How this crisis became real, and how a new power, the Western Chalukyas, used the same structure to replace the Rashtrakutas, is the story that will take us forward. From here begins the final journey of the Rashtrakutas. To understand the final phase of the Rashtrakuta Empire, the biggest mistake would be to assume that its fall happened because of one single war or one weak ruler. The reality is much calmer, and therefore much deeper. The empire was not tired, it was overexpanded. And when a power depends on too many regions, too many Samanthas, and too many fronts, its balance slowly begins to weaken. After Krishna III, Rashtrakuta power still existed, but it no longer had the same decisive energy. Military success had become reactive. Every campaign was now fought not for expansion, but to maintain the existing situation. This subtle shift is very important, because this is the point where an empire moves into a defensive position. The biggest problem once again became the same issue from which the Rashtrakutas themselves had once emerged, the growing power of the Samanthas. The local rulers, who were earlier considered necessary for control, were now behaving almost independently in their own regions. The center still demanded taxes and loyalty from them, but its ability to control them was slowly weakening. In this background, a new power was rising in the Western Deccan, the Western Chalukyas. This was not an external invasion, but the same old cycle of history. Just as the Rashtrakutas had once emerged from within the Chalukya system, the Western Chalukyas were now rising from within the Rashtrakuta framework. Talapa became the face of this change. He was not a sudden conqueror. He was part of the Rashtrakuta system itself, who understood in time that the center of power had once again become weak. He did exactly what Danti Durga had done earlier. He recognized the weakness, strengthened his position, and waited for the right moment. By the time of Karka II, Rashtrakuta authority still existed formally, but in practical terms its control had become very limited. When Talapa delivered the final blow, it was not recorded as a great war. It was another transfer of power, almost without noise. The Rashtrakuta Empire ends here, but its structures do not disappear. The administrative system, the land grant structure, the relations with Samanthas, all of these were adopted by the new rulers. In history, empires often fall, but their methods survive. This is the greatest legacy of the Rashtrakutas. They were the first to clearly connect the politics of North and South India. They showed that the Deccan was not just a middle region, but a center capable of shaping the politics of the entire subcontinent. Kannada language and literature received royal patronage, temple architecture reached new heights, and administration took a practical form based not on ideals alone, but on real power balance. The story of the Rashtrakutas also teaches us how limited words like great and weak are in history. The same empire can be a result of opportunity in its beginning, an example of balance in its middle phase, and a warning of overexpansion in its end. The system through which Danti Durga gained power was the same system through which that power eventually ended. This was not failure, it was historical continuity. When we look back, the Rashtrakutas do not appear like a glorious legend. They feel more real. Their power rose, functioned, changed, and finally transferred, without miracles, without myths. And perhaps that is why they are still worth understanding today. The Deccan is still a strong pillar of India's politics, culture, and economy. This central role did not develop suddenly. Among the rulers who shaped it, the contribution of the Rashtrakutas is deep and lasting. In history, some empires are remembered for their stories, and some for their processes. The Rashtrakutas belong to the second kind. Their story does not tell us what power is. It explains how power works. And that understanding is what keeps history alive. If you like this story, please make sure to like the video, share it with those who are interested in understanding serious history, and subscribe to the channel for more long-form history content like this. What do you think? Was the fall of the Rashtrakutas a weakness or a natural change of history? Do write your opinion in the comments. In the next episode, we will see how power in the Deccan passes into the hands of the Western Chalukyas after the Rashtrakutas, and how the same political structure gives birth to a new power.